welcome. I'm very happy to have the privilege of moderating this panel tonight. I thought it would be best, rather than for me to introduce everybody, I'm going to let the panelists do that because I want you to associate name and face and get used to them, get familiar with them yourselves. So we'll start with Gabrielle Bullock.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Gabrielle Bullock. I'm principal and architect and Perkins & Will's Director of Global Diversity. I am here because I am very passionate. I'm a passionate advocate for both architecture and inclusion, equity, and diversity in our profession.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Lang. I'm the architecture critic for Curbed and the author of a bunch of books. The most recent one is called The Design of Childhood. And I know that the organizers asked me here today because of an article that I wrote last year called The End of the Architect Profile. And the subhead of that article was, "It's time to stop perpetuating the myth of the lone genius." So I feel like that is something that we are going to discuss tonight. And I think I'm here to talk about that myth from the journalist perspective and to talk about, how both journalism and architecture have to move towards telling a richer and truer story about how buildings and other projects actually get put together.
Hi everyone, Marianella Duprile. I am an architecture writer and I'm also an activist. I'm a member of the Architecture Lobby, which is an organization that really advocates for the value of architectural labor and fights for a more just profession, and so I think that's why I'm here. I write a lot about how to do that, and I recently wrote an article that deals a little bit with this architect myth and maybe some specific steps that we can take toward moving away from that. So I think we'll talk a little bit about that. I hope we'll talk a little bit about that this evening.
Hi everyone, I'm Beth White. I'm the president and CEO of the Houston Parks Board. I'm a great admirer of architects, a hirer of architects, and also I've worked in the planning field in a number of different transportation, housing, parks, open space, and have seen the value of collaboration and seen the role that architects can play. So I think I'm here sort of representing the client's point of view and an admirer of the work that architects do every day.
The definition of architect, just to start with, our professional title of our discipline is basically started back in the 16th century. So, and it means, I'm sure most of you know, master builder. So that definition, has led to 500 years of public belief that the architect was just that, a master builder. And given that history, I would pose the question to the panel is, how do we convey the knowledge that the practice of architecture is not a singular activity, and that the role, and what role, I guess, would collaboration play in the real life of an architect?
First of all, I think that we're not so much master builders anymore. I think that architects have become much more specialized in many different areas of what we do. And so collaboration is almost a natural and a necessity. So I think that while we all think that we can do everything expertly, I think that collaboration is a much more realistic way that we do business and come to the best designs, in my opinion.
I guess when I hear the term master builder, I just think about Frank Lloyd Wright writing his own mythology. And I was on a panel last year where people were talking about whether Frank Lloyd Wright matters anymore, and I was there to say that he doesn't matter anymore. And I think it's really important not to let architects write their own mythology. I think that journalists and critics, it's incumbent upon them to look at what is actually happening in architecture and not just take the architect's word for it. And I mean, as Gabrielle said, there's so many other things going on. Projects today are so much larger and more complicated and require so many more specialized skills and trades. I don't think that's necessarily what we always talk about as collaboration. Maybe it's more like working together. There are lots of people working towards the common goal. And so if we want to consider that work fairly, we have to think about, okay, who was responsible for this? Who gave this work the quality that I'm actually interested in? And sometimes that means you have to go and talk to a different person who's not the person that the press release has at the top of the press release. So.
Yeah, it's often so much about like who gets credit for things and like whose name goes on things. Like one thing that we talked about in the lead up to this is, whose name is on the door. It's always like one person's name on the door when we all know that it takes a ton of, it's impossible to make a building with just one person. And I think this, when I think about it, I think it often has one root, at least in our education. And if I could see the room better, which I cannot, I would ask people to raise their hands and ask how many people had a studio where they, in an architecture school, where they actually had to work with someone else on a project. And that's so rare, right, to actually experience that in school. Maybe you have like a partner project, maybe you have like one studio, and like even when you do, you're like kind of like begrudgingly doing it, and it's like the worst one of all of them, or you don't like it or whatever. So there's this kind of like general reticence to work in a collective fashion. I think that starts off pretty early, and I think what that does is it sets up in the profession and in a lot of the minds of people in the profession this idea that change only comes from like the top down, like you yourself or whoever is like the boss or the principal of the firm has like all of the power, and that's how you affect change in the world. And I think that we see that not only in the way in which buildings get designed, but also in the way in which the profession kind of works, and the way in which change happens in the profession. And so I think that one way, I mean, I don't know if we're talking about like how to change this, but one way to start to get some change happening around this would be to think about different education models that veer a little bit away from this Beaux-Arts model of, well, there's a master and apprentice, and this master is imparting knowledge upon you that then you will use on your singular project. And I think that could easily be done away with, and I know that there's already educators who are working on that.
I found it really interesting being posed this question about a master builder, and I thought back through my career, would I have ever described an architect as a master builder? And having managed projects that are teams with architects, engineers, designers, artists, electricians, and would they have described an architect's role as a master builder? No, they design it, we build it. They don't know how to build it. They tell us what they want it to look like, and then we figure it out. And I think that's changed, and I see more and more work toward working as a team, and this respect among these disciplines, because you need them all to build anything, whether it's a building or a fence. But I just thought that was interesting in listening to the conversation we had the other day, like where that term comes from. But the master, whether you're a master carpenter or a master electrician, but a master builder was so all-encompassing.
An architect came up with it, I'm sure.
And I've worked with a few that I think would fit that or carry that sign around with them. So I just thought that was a fascinating thing to learn about this, where master builder came from.
Mm-hmm.
It seems easier to make that argument when your name isn't on the door. The idea that it takes a lot of people to produce that. But when you have someone's name up on the door, I don't know who comes to mind right away. I have to say Frank Gehry comes to my mind because my first job was in his office. So Frank Gehry, architects across the door. And in his mind, I'm quite certain, the buck stops there. And so, a lot of people work on the project. A lot of people have influence over the result. A lot of people, it takes a lot of people. It takes a lot of minds working to complete that project. But in his mind, it's his project, still. He's like 93, so he's been at this maybe 70 years. So I'm thinking in terms of perpetuating or not perpetuating that myth. It's not a myth in his mind. And, so we're reacting in a way to that sense that the public has about who is the architect. When you say Frank Gehry, they don't think about the 100 people in his office. They think about him. So, yes, it takes a village, but so I guess I throw that question back again. If Jeannie Gang's name is on the door, it's okay, right? It's okay. We want more women who have name on the door, but it's still that who's responsible in the end. And when you get these firms like, any of the large firms, right? They have their names up there. In many cases, those people might not even be living anymore, but their names are still,
Right.
they're still ahead of the firm. So it's easier in a way to perpetuate the myth of the single architect, the master builder architect, when it's a single person's name that is the headliner, the single person's name who captures the headlines all the time. So throwing that back a little bit.
Well, so for Perkins and Will, both Larry Perkins and Phil Will, they're dead. But so the challenge for the firm to maintain and perpetuate the quality of design, excellence of design, and everything else that we do, it's a lot more difficult, right? So we do have some pretty well-known designers in the firm, and we promote them, and we highlight them, and we celebrate them, but equally, we celebrate the teams behind them, because nobody represents those two names anymore, right? It's the brand, it's the value system,
Right.
And it's how we do business. And so that takes a lot more effort, a lot more direction, and a lot more commitment from the top down. So I think that, I understand the name on the door, but let's think about, there's a firm in Los Angeles called Design Bitches. So they're two women, neither one of their names is on the door, unless you want to call them a bitch. And I think it seems to me that that's the way of the future, that you can still have authorship and design credit without having just your name on the door.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with that. And I was going to say that I don't see younger firms, like people that I see establishing their own firms now, doing it that way, doing it with one name. I think, there's much more kind of cleverness around self-branding, kind of reinventing yourself as a firm. I'm thinking of like Design Bitches or LA Moss or, your friend's future firm, like kind of giving themselves, like as a group, a name, and pushing that forward. And then the flip side of that is I see a lot of these older firms that had somebody's name on the door struggling with their succession plan and going to initials or, suddenly discovering that they have all these partners who had been doing all the work all along. Mm-hmm. And so I think at both ends of the spectrum, you see a struggle with this mythology, and so I don't think it's being perpetuated, but it may be being chipped at from the bottom rather than the top, which, as Marianella was saying, is the way that change is going to have to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's all these massively talented people who maybe would just never get the chance to have their name on the door for whatever many reasons, could personal reasons, or I don't know, maybe they don't want their name on the door. And so I think it's, not just about getting more women's names on the door, but rather just changing the fact that that is the model of success. And I think, Alexander, what you're saying is that that model of success, being a successful architect, is no longer necessarily the one model, right? You're not just successful if you end up getting your name on the door. And for me, it's a question of just making the profession more open and accessible for all kinds of different people to be able to do it if they want. I think maybe we'll get into this later, but I think we know that architecture is a really difficult profession to get into. just even starting from education, the fact that it's, really long hours, even in school, a lot of on-site education, so it's like very difficult to do if you have a kid or if you work a job, because you have to be in studio all day. And so I think for me, it's not necessarily about, okay, like let's just get like more diverse names on the door, but let's change the fact that is, still more or less like the success model.
It's really interesting if you think about architecture firms and law firms. And, I think about my guilty pleasure watching Suits, if you haven't seen it. It's a fabulous show. It's a whole family thing. Call my mom afterwards. But this big race to get your name on the door, it is a visceral thing in law firms if you really want to show you're successful. And I was thinking about Frank Gehry, who I've had the pleasure to work with, and pleasure of having to approve one of his projects, which was really interesting. But, and Jeannie, Jeannie's company's name is Studio Gang, which is really clever. And it still has her name out there, but it does have this branding of a collective. And I know how she works and how her team works. But it is fascinating. Perkins & Will has a brand. It's a valuable brand. So what do you do with that? And I think that's really the essence of this, that when you put your name on something, it's there to show your commitment, your level of expertise. And the fact that that's changing in the architecture world and being creative, like, studio bitches, you said, I love that.
Design.
Or design
I'm
bitches.
just going
I
to
want to
keep
hire
saying
them
that
just
every
for their
opportunity I
name.
get. Design.
But
Well, I have to add-
it's a very important thing to see that shift, and I think it's happening more and more. I don't think it'll ever happen with law firms, but I think in architecture we have a chance.
I have to say that over the evolution of Frank's office, it was Frank O. Gehry Architects, and then it was Frank O. Gehry Associates, and now it's Gehry Partners.
Well, there is an evolution there.
So one other thing attached to this is, given the public, so part of our mission, I guess, is to get the public to understand this change or this evolution, if you want. And given the public's need for celebrity, I'd like you to argue with me about that. It's evident in sports and in Hollywood and science, Nobel laureates, literature, the Pulitzer Prize, and architecture with the Pritzker Prize. And I'm sure you might remember that they wouldn't even split the Pritzker Prize between Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. So this idea that in a world where we reward the single architect for achievement, how do you reconcile that with the reality that no great building is ever achieved without collaboration?
Somebody else want to start?
Well, I think the Pritzker Prize has basically like shot itself in the foot when it refused to add Denise Scott Brown to Robert Venturi's win after the petition. And I feel like in the years since that happened, like that huge controversy happened, people have been paying less and less attention to it, while on the other hand, the Pritzker has started awarding the prize to 2 and even 3 partner firms. So, the Pritzker Prize was changed by that controversy, though they didn't make all the change that they should have. But I guess I feel like it's increasingly irrelevant on a number of levels. So I don't feel like that should be how we, kind of how we judge the validity of architecture in the celebrity marketplace. I always tell people the only architecture prize I really like is the AIA 25-year award, because it focuses on a work of architecture, like the work, not the people. And after enough time has passed, that we can really judge like how effective it is to its original purpose and to the present day. And so like to me, like that's the perfect award, and the rest of the awards, are kind of a beauty contest.
And I have a hard time, I'm not sure the public You know, who is the public that we're talking about? And I think it's us, right? And so we care who's getting these awards. But I think most of the public, they may know significant names, Frank O'Geary, I.M. Pei, and others. But I think beyond that, it's how we perpetuate ourselves that's going to change that perception that it's a single individual, that it's not a single individual.
There's also kind of motive in like celebrity trading and like getting attention to whatever it is, whether it's an article that, you know, it's easier to say, okay, like this like big name architect like did this project and you get more clicks that way, or whether it's I don't know, like a brand new building in a city, you know, like the coveted like, you know, but now the coveted like Bilbao effect, which has now been like dismissed as this kind of myth. You know, getting like a celebrity architect or a architect to like do a building so that like more people go to it or whatever. So I think there is like, it's not just like a public need for celebrity, but there's like really like a market need for celebrity, and it makes things like more easily consumable. And so I actually don't really know how you change that outright. But it's really, we're thinking about, you know, what would it look like if, you know, there was like a brand new building and maybe it wasn't like a super celebrity architect, but it was a great building. Like, would people like still go to it, and how would it be talked about? How would people talk about it? How would people like draw others to it without, you know, relying on the name or brand recognition?
I mean, I feel like that's happening a little bit already with the marquee parks in a lot of cities, because landscape architects, even though like I can tell you who like the 5 celebrity firms are, like most people don't know those names. And so like the parks themselves have become the star and have become the draw, and people don't actually know who made them. And I think the coverage tends to reflect that, because it's talking much more about the public experience and how this contributes to the city. And so it like takes the focus off the singular object and then the singular maker. And so like maybe that, you know, kind of looking at like landscape architecture coverage versus architecture coverage is a good way to think about kind of moderating and changing the dialogue around new projects.
I think it's a really interesting environment in which we live, particularly in America. We live in a celebrity culture, you know, whether it's in the Starchitects, as we were talking about, or YouTube. You know, someone being a celebrity in Time Magazine, wasn't it YouTube? Or who's the person of the year? It's you, and it was all these different people. But it's a fascinating dynamic when you think about awards or becoming known to get more work, you know, and that recognition. But the idea of the actual product receiving the award as opposed to the firm or the person, I do think in parks that's such a great observation, because it is the park that becomes known. But for the field of architecture, do you want a few starchitects out there that elevate the profession? That's what I'm sitting here thinking. If they are spokespeople versus celebrities or starchitects. I mean, there's a positive side to it for the general public to understand the role of architects. So that I'm just sitting here thinking, you know, playing devil's advocate, what are the advantages of people knowing who Frank Lloyd Wright is, and then having that next conversation about where things have changed. And I moved here from Chicago, where Frank Lloyd Wright is like, how dare you say he's irrelevant? I mean, that is in the DNA, along with Daniel Burnham, the, you know, godfather of planning. So I think there is a value to it, but it was overdone. So now how do you take some positive thing from that? And also, I have seen over the years architects becoming far more engaged in civic dialogue and civic engagement and working in communities in a very different way. And we were talking about this at lunch. And that role of not just being a really brilliant designer, but a facilitator and someone who listens. And I think that's a big change that I've seen that has enormous value in this field.
I think while that change is going on, and I would argue that it is, but I think there's also this attachment, if you want, to a value system. I mean, you can make an argument about Frank Gehry's architecture. You could sort of say, okay, you may not, it's stylistic more than anything else. I've heard that argument many, many times. But you can look at a building and you can know if it's a Frank Gehry building. The same thing is true for Morphosis, even though they don't have, it doesn't say Tom Main on the door. Everyone knows that it's a Morphosis building when you see it. So behind that is also a kind of declared, if you want, value system. And that declared value system, what is that joke? A camel is a horse designed by committee. So sometimes that declared value system is more impactful on the trajectory of architecture than a building that was in fact the result of many authors. So what about that?
I'll jump in. I don't think design by committee is always a derogatory term, and I know in the architecture field it is, and I've heard that a lot. But I do think, and so many studies have been proven out in terms of collaboration and ideas, and especially of inclusion and diversity, you get a better product. So the design as a process, I think, I like camels. You know? I don't know. I struggle with that. Is that a bad thing? So again, not an architect, but I think that the inputs that architects get, it is by committee. I mean, you're bringing in all these ideas, and if you're really taking in the context, that is a committee. So anyway, that's my personal reaction to.
And I think that I agree with Beth in the design process, that there are many voices and there should be many perspectives brought to the table. It makes a richer solution. I do think that design can't be by committee, but I do think that there's a way to engage the entire team or whoever has the inclination in design with a set of established goals and principles before you get going, and so that when you have to evaluate one idea over another, you know what you're evaluating against to avoid the subjectivity of, well, I'm the design principal, so we're going to do it my way. Because the rest of that team could sabotage your design, it won't get built.
That never happens.
So I think that there's ways to control the quality of design that you set out to do without having a single individual be the designer. But there must be an arbiter at the end of the day to keep the horse from becoming a camel.
If your intention is a horse, absolutely.
That's true.
Yeah. And I guess, like, as a critic, I feel like I've gone far too often to buildings by a firm that is known for a certain look, and it's like the third or fourth building down the line with that look, and it's really not suitable for its purpose. And the client sometimes wants that, but they should not be given that. So.
Okay, let's talk about that.
What exactly do you
The
mean?
client should not be given that.
Okay, well, let's see.
But I think
How many details am I
but
gonna
I
do
do
here?
appreciate
Was
what
it
you're saying, the
something I said?
designer-
No. It's
do you
like this
keep that
situation
true?
where somebody wants a brand name object. I mean, honestly, like the hot topic in architecture today, I feel, is Vessel in New York City, and I have dutifully filed my review, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like that's a perfect example of a client wanting an object that everyone will talk about that he should not have been given. And that is on the architect, and that is, I mean, I guess it's on the client too, but I don't know. When you have $1 billion, like, I guess you can get what you want. But now New York City is stuck with this thing that should really be a sort of temporary fun fair object, but I can't even remember how much it costs, but I guess, like, it's there forever. It's very bizarre. It's very bizarre. I took my kids and they hated it.
Is it there forever? I mean, it looks so. not,
I guess
not
they could
like
ship
that.
it. They could ship it back to Italy. I mean, we
Fine.
could, they,
Crane it.
yeah, they could
Yeah.
take it back apart and ship it back to Italy. I like that idea.
But that is a real difference, I think, in many ways between an architect with a commission versus an artist with a commission. And I think there is a different level of, like you were saying, if the client shouldn't have got it, what would the architect do? How do you change that perception or respond to your client need? I think it's a really,
Yeah, I mean,
when you say they shouldn't be given that, I'm just intrigued.
Yeah.
But, okay, so then what's the option?
One would like to think that the architect should say, I know you hired me because I like to apply like metal panels to the outside of my building. But in this case, what if we just applied the metal panel over here because, the other side is facing a school and it's going to bounce light into the playground, and really it would be much nicer for the kids if it was blah, blah, blah. So, like, you can have your moment. Like, you want your building to look as fabulous as your friends' buildings, but we also have, like, a different purpose here. I mean, I don't know. Like, I haven't honestly been in on those conversations.
It's a struggle, yeah.
But, I mean, hopefully, like, part of the reason you get to that level in architecture is because you're fairly convincing. So, use your convincing powers for good.
That's a good admonition.
I think sometimes the powers of convincing have to do with actually pushing the edge of the envelope. And once again, I think that you might consider there's room for both kinds of practices. I mean, to just annihilate one kind of practice and say this is the way it is and this is the way it should be because this is better and it's fairer and this is the way we design anyway, that's a point of view, I think. I think that, you need someone like Frank Gehry to come along every now and then and say, oh, I'm going to, make my buildings out of chain link. Because I don't know if you remember what it was like when he started doing that. The entire world was like, what? Is this stuff? And look where he's come from there. And I'm just using him as an example, not because he's like the answer to everything. But he's easy because most everybody knows him. So at least it's easy to refer to him. But I think there is something about pushing the envelope. And I am curious if you think that can actually be done in such a nice collaborative way.
I don't think collaboration is always nice and easy. I think it's messy and sloppy and hard, and people get pissed off. And it's seriously, I think about this a lot because it's managing a not-for-profit. We're always in the middle. We're not public sector. We're not for-profit. So we're constantly having to help facilitate a conversation. And if people don't show up with passion and push for what they want, you will get a bad product. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, think about what collaboration is. It's about sharing power. That's not easy for humans to do. We don't want to share our toys when we're kids. It's so I just would say I wouldn't want to sugarcoat the challenge that collaboration really is, but there's a lot of power with that. So I would say that, yeah, you do want people to push the envelope. And one thing I was thinking about is the architect for the vessel, are they proud of that work? I'd be curious to hear if they could be candid. Do they feel they compromised there, or was that their vision as well? So I think that's always a really interesting tension to me between the architect's vision and the client. And I think of the Medici family, or, it's just fascinating that tension.
Yeah. It's the Thomas Heatherwick studio, so he's actually a designer and not an architect, which, like, a lot of people were correcting. But I think, I think that was the vision of the studio.
Interesting.
But, yeah. I guess the other thing is, like, and this is definitely my point of view, like, I don't believe that that pushing the envelope and like new ideas can just come from one person. I mean, I think about my own creative process. Actually, I was talking earlier just about like how I use Twitter a lot just to think out loud, and it's like, oh, I'm having a conversation about, you know, whatever I'm thinking about writing about, and like my idea gets better through the conversation. I mean, isn't that what we're really talking about in terms of collaboration? And like, why can't chain link fence for your house come out of something like that? I mean, it feels like it's right there to me. It doesn't feel like a leap to say that.
I'm sure he got the idea from somewhere too. Well, actually, I don't know. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it did just spring from his mind palace. But yeah, I think yeah, ideas don't have to just come from a single person. And often, even if it does, you know, come from a single person, then it takes a lot of that really hard work to actually bring them to fruition. Even if it's just, you know, actually building the building. And so I think that's. For me, that's a really key question. And the other key question is like, who can even get to that point of being able to like push their like really brilliant idea? And how do we make the profession a place that's like more open to all kinds of people to reach that point? I mean, I think this question of like wage transparency is really important in that sense, because you know, if you are a woman in the profession and you're already, you know, probably going to be making like less money on average. That's like a statistic that's known. And then, you know, maybe you like are struggling and supporting yourself, and like you can't sustain like being in the profession because you like don't make as much money as maybe your peer. And you don't know that because it's totally opaque and you have no access. So I think that's like one really like key thing that could change, that would really change the field for people, because then when it does come time to negotiate, we could say, well, like I already know like how much money X person is making, and I can like base my decision to negotiate or not on that knowledge. And it's not this like crazy like back channel game like you're trying to play all the time. So yeah, for me, that's really the question, is like, what, you know, changes can we make within the profession? And I think there's also changes to be made outside of the profession that then would make it a lot easier for people who I'm sure are, you know, as talented as Frank Gehry to make it in the profession and not have to leave because it's just not suitable for them, right? Architecture is kind of just a hard field to be in. How do we make it less hard?
Take that opportunity to move the questions to the more sort of pragmatic side of that, if you want. Like, so one of the criteria that's often cited for advancement within a firm is quote unquote leadership qualities. So typically women are considered to be good collaborators. By nature, we've accepted that mantle somehow. So how does the good collaborator help them or hinder them when advancement is on the table?
So 3 of us decided we didn't like this question. Because we didn't want to be pegged as the only species that is a good collaborator, nor one that just takes that nurture thing. And so we didn't really like it. So, but I do think that leadership, that the ability to collaborate and team and communicate and deal with complicated, sticky issues in what we do and the people we do it with is important for anybody who's going to be a leader. Mm-hmm. And the more diverse that team that you're leading, the more skills you need. Mm-hmm. Because channeling and managing good conflict, which there will be, takes a unique set of skills. And that is in my diversity world, that is the marked difference between when I was in school in the 80s and how we practice today. That there is not one person designing anymore, and the team is diverse and messy. So.
Right, like leading isn't just saying, okay, like this is where we're going, and like I'm saying that, and so you're all going to like follow me. There's a lot of like it's much more difficult and like messy and complicated to be a leader. You have to get buy-in from people. You have to negotiate different ideas maybe that come from your team or the people that you work with. You have to make decisions according to that. You have to maybe make a compromise, or you have to maybe make the difficult decision of choosing one path that maybe is unpopular, but maybe you have some knowledge that like that's the thing that's going to work out. And so I think it's not, I actually think collaboration is, and being able to make decisions collectively and being able to listen is one of the most important qualities for being a good and effective leader, probably in anything, not just in architecture. So I would say, I don't know, maybe the question puts the two things at conflict, but I don't think they are at conflict in the best case of scenarios.
And there have been so many studies of CEOs, and there was something on public radio the other day. The good qualities of CEOs are actually kind of antisocial. So there's that yin and yang, but the idea of collaboration, and then when someone has to make a decision, like making clear what that decision-making structure is. But I also think about something you said earlier about the name on the firm or what you're aspiring to, and the leader is there to help provide the vision, but the vision is a collective one, and how do you get there is, like you were saying, through listening, first of all, but to lead a team is a very different thing than the more hierarchical leadership that we saw in years past. And I think that's changing even in Frank's world, which I think is really fascinating that you bring him up when you think he's 93, still practicing. And just that change on the name of the firm, that's a big step. So I think that's something for us to all think about, and also recognizing that everyone leads, just at different times. And so sometimes you also have to step back and follow and not, and embrace that as an opportunity, and also something that's really important for all of us to do. We don't always have to be seen as the leader to get something done.
I know I posed the question as two things opposing each other, but the fact of the matter is, and particularly in larger firms, there are mechanisms for evaluation, and you can evaluate people by their qualities, and so it becomes, in a way, it becomes a tool for keeping people from progressing. And a reason it came to mind is because I was basing it on something that recently happened in a firm that I'm quite aware of, to someone who was pulled aside and said, you'd do a lot better if you were actually married. And I didn't think those things could happen anymore, anywhere, but they still do. And so the mechanisms for measuring your success are also the mechanisms used to kind of keep you in your place, as it were.
What did that mean? You'd do better if you were married? Like, you'd be a better person?
You would be a better role model in our firm.
Okay.
Whoa. Well,
So to kind of wrap that up, it was recently I heard that there was a program, maybe you've heard of it, it's called the 20-cent challenge. You heard of this? Can't really see. Anyway, the idea was that the architects in our profession, men make more money, and women are like 20 cents shy of every dollar that's made by male architects. So some firms, including Studio Gang, has adopted this 20-cent challenge. So my last question is, what are some of the other things? To me, that's a reasonable challenge that most firms can bring themselves to meet. What are some of the other things that could be done to make the workplace more inviting and more accepting of diversity that will allow women in particular, but it's not just gender issue, but women to actually move through and up and through the profession, because, you know, the fact is we still have only 18 to 20% that are licensed and that are actually practicing out of the 50% average of students in school. And I would like to see that percentage go up. So I'm curious to hear in all this discussion of the work environment, the collaborative environment, and so on, how do we make an environment that is structured to encourage movement?
So Perkins and Will has established, it's been 6 years now, a focused effort on focusing on diversity, inclusion, and engagement. And it's both qualitative and quantitative, and the idea is to shift the culture so that it becomes part of our DNA. And we're doing quite well. We're not there yet. And so we focus on all things diverse and equity. And so I'm not familiar with the 20-cent challenge, but we have for many years done pay equity analysis, but we've made it formal in the last 2 years, and it's verified by a third party. And so and adjustments are made when necessary. So I think in order to make change, you have to be deliberate and intentional. And so that's what we're trying to do across the board, both within the firm and in the profession. And you know, you say there's 50% women, so there's only 452 Black licensed female architects in this country. Mm-hmm. And that's the smallest gap in our profession.
How many?
It is the small, 452.
Wow.
So if we want to talk about, you know, reflecting the society and the clients we serve, I think that's certainly one of them that needs to be tackled. So.
Yeah, I think there's things that can be done within the profession. I think this question of the 20-cent challenge, that's really great, but then I think the power to like honor that is still in the hands of maybe like a few firm owners or principals, where if there was just wage transparency across the board, a lot of maybe just like young architects would have the power to say, whoa, like I'm not making what maybe I should be making. I think there's also other things within the, you know, profession, like paid sick leave and paid parental leave makes it really hard. You know, if you have a kid, to like not be able to take time off, you know, or like if you, whereas like maybe if you could like have paid parental leave, you could take that time, or you could, maybe if your spouse has parental leave, your spouse could take that time and you could go to work and, you know, put in the hours at your firm or whatever it may be. I mean, I think by the same token, something that's outside of the profession are, you know, fights for universal childcare. That would be just incredible. It would relieve a lot of young parents in terms of being able to take care of their child and, you know, continue and work. You know, there was a study done by the AIA Equity by Design a couple of years ago that showed the way in which especially women kind of start dropping off intervals in the profession, kind of like the further they go along, like the fewer women there are who stay in the profession, because it just gets more and more difficult, especially if they're raising a family, and you know that relates to like who does the child rearing work, and that's like a bigger societal problem. But there are ways to start to address it. And I think the other big thing that I think about in terms of this question is a fight that already exists, which is a fight for a $15 minimum wage. And I think about how that would have like really changed my life when I was in school, because I worked while I was in school. And if I had made $15, I would have had to work a lot less, which means that I would have been able to spend a lot more time in studio. So those are things that really I think would change just like the baseline for a lot of people to then be able to, you know, finish their education, get a really good education, and then move into the profession with just you know, a higher like baseline and a lower barrier for entry.
Yeah, I would echo everything that's said, and I think your point about societal change is really critical, and you know, being deliberate and intentional and taking those actions really makes a difference. And you know, in terms of how you manage your hiring practices and really offering up opportunities for flexibility, as you were saying. And one thing I was thinking about, and we talked a little bit about at lunch, is what's happening in the workplace when you're, multi-generational in workplaces. And there is a generation of people working who don't have the same value about work in terms of how important it is to your identity and your life as, say, the baby boomer generation. And I'll give you an example I shared at lunch, and it will be to protect the innocent, no names used. But a dear friend of mine who's a partner at a law firm, and she had hired an associate and invested a lot in this young woman associate, and worked her like a dog. And then she decided she just didn't want to do that with her life anymore and quit. And my friend was just totally mystified and did a exit interview, because to her, getting her name on that door, that was the driver for her career. And when she did this exit interview and asked the young woman, well, why are you leaving? Do you like the work? Yep, love the work, but I don't understand. And then she said, because I don't want to turn into you. I don't want to work 20 hours a day. And my friend was like, oh my God. And she had to think about her. That is what she did to get her name on that door. So it's a really interesting thing to see the shift, which I think is a really healthy shift. And the other thing I would say is, what you can do are things like this, and I really commend the women in architecture for having this type of forum and talk about these things and figure out what you can do to support one another, because there are a lot of women who did take on the leadership battles and trying to be like men, and then not helping others come behind them. And that's just wrong. So, if you can't figure out a way to create community in your profession and workplace, it's not going to change. So I commend you for doing this panel tonight.
I have two questions from the audience, and that apparently is all we have time for. In an increasingly we practice instead of me, what becomes the role of the architect? What makes an architect indispensable to a multidisciplinary team of engineers, interior designers, landscape consultants, and so on?
I think we're still the orchestra leader. I think I think our career, our profession, how we've been taught, allows us to see the big picture and all the different parts, and probably the best conductor out of all of those disciplines.
Yeah, there's also very specific architectural disciplinary expertise that I think, an interior designer doesn't get, maybe an engineer doesn't get either. And so I think that, in terms of like, how do materials go together? How do you scale something to fit in its context? How do you detail a wall assembly? All those things are really architecturally specific to the discipline. And so I think that that's not to be undermined, even as it is partnered with other expertise that's maybe just as important.
Along those lines, I guess, if one is not a good leader, how do they advance in the design realm without having to be, a manager or some other undesired position? You get stuck. What's open to you? How do you succeed if leadership is not your primary skill?
Well, I think anybody can be a leader if they want to be one. I think that, unfortunately, path to design leadership typically is through design work, and that has typically been men. And so that's what's got to change. We're seeing in our firm, because we're making we know that we have a gender issue with designers in our firm. We do not have enough women. And so we've acknowledged that, and we're focusing on how to fix that. So I think the path to leadership within design is a challenge that needs to be addressed across the profession. I think most of us, I came through the management path. I never saw myself as the starchitect. I didn't see anybody like me who was a starchitect. So my natural inclination was through management and technical. And I would say that the majority of women in my age bracket would say something very similar. But I see that changing. The emerging professionals, kids right out of school, they do not want to go the way I went. They want to be design director tomorrow.
Yep.
And we have to figure out how to give them the opportunities along the way so that they will be there tomorrow, because otherwise they're going to go. So we have a lot of changing to do.
I also think, I mean, that seems like a reason that people often start their own firms and work in partnerships. I mean, I always think of design partnerships. A lot of design partners are married, but sometimes it's just kind of the same dynamic of a marriage where each partner has a different skill, and you sort of, when you interview, you know, architecture partnerships, you see, oh, like this person is the front man or front woman, and this person really loves to design and would be happy just sitting in the office all day designing. Honestly, my husband is a little bit like that. So I feel like maybe it's not only like finding leadership for yourself, but like finding leadership with another person or another couple of people that you have complementary skills with, and like sort of together you can rise, like together you can make things happen. Because, you know, I mean, not everyone likes to talk in front of people. Not everyone can do that, and that's fine. Like, you know, why should all architects have to do that? So I think, you know, there should be other modes that you can work in where like you can use your skills, but also understand what you lack and find that in other people.
I think it's also a question of like what's valued within the profession, and how is it valued, and thinking about, you know, what's essential to the practice of a firm, and whose labor is essential to the practice of a firm. And often in this like more hierarchical model, it seems like, okay, well, if you're at the top, then you're like really essential. If you're at the bottom, you're like easily replaceable. And so I think for me, it's also a question of changing that a little bit, and of getting recognition for everyone who works in a firm, and not just those at the top. I mean, this ties back to the question of like, okay, whose name's on the door? But I think it is important to recognize that, you know, it's the work of everyone that matters. And then I think what you were saying made me think about how important it is to have good mentors. To kind of find your way in a field, and how kind of seeking that out, I think, can really make a big difference in terms of seeking out a good mentor, and being just able to find one can make a big difference in the way that you relate to the field and your potential trajectory.
Hearing everything that you've all said, which I agree with completely, makes me think about, just reflect on how I went through my own career and choices I made. And I think that, you know, just thinking about for yourself, know yourself, and don't get hung up on, am I a leader, am I not a leader? But also look for where your talents are, where your passions are, and if you're not finding it or an opportunity to express that, find it some other place. Go volunteer for a project and say, hey, I'll lead this, or really find a way to channel that, and then you'll discover that opportunity. And I don't know if this is coming from a person young in their career or in a new phase of the career, but there is something to be said for paying your dues, and for, you know, taking opportunities where you find them, or finding a place where you fit, and look for any opportunity to volunteer, and just, you know, raise your hand and say, hey, I'll take that on. Yeah, take a risk.
If you do form a partnership, I'm a big proponent for odd numbers. I had there are three women partners in my firm, and it was really great because there was always a tiebreaker. So if you really got into a deadlock on a decision, there was always one person who could break that tie. So whatever works. Anyway, I want to thank our panel for joining us this evening. I thought it was a terrific group.
Thank you.